So what's happening in Belarus is obviously an ongoing situation. But there's a few more things I want to say which I didn't mention in the previous video. Um, Firstly, Belarus is a country that really has seen a history of tragedy. It was absolutely devastated by World War II. I mean, a lot of countries were, but Belarus really did suffer some of the most intense fighting and intense tragedy, along with Poland, Ukraine, um, and Russia itself off the Eastern Front. And then, of course, it was the country that was most impacted by the fallout from Chernobyl, which I understand was actually in Ukrainian territory, but the fallout went into Belarus. Um, but it's very clear the people there have had enough of Lukashenko and his regime. An interesting thing about this is that women have played a very important role. Women in white have formed lines. Um, so I think that gives credence to the fact they're not armed, the fact they're not being violent, to the nature of this situation. Um, it's interesting. Last week, Margarita Simonian, who is the head of RT, or as I like to call it, Putin News, she was already on the distortion campaign, as RT has done with every situation of the last, well, since its founding, that Russia has had some involvement in. I'm quoting the London Times here. Last week, Margarita Simonian, head of the Kremlin propaganda channel RT, tweeted provocatively that it was time for the polite people to establish order in Belarus, a reference to the Russian soldiers sent to annex Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula. Um, Now, there is some pro-government protests, or there was, I should say, but they were small, the pro-Lukashenko faction. And that's unusual, for a president who claims to have had 80% of the winning vote. You would think that his supporters would be a bit more vocal. I think an important thing about Belarus, where it differs from Ukraine, is that this is very much an internal thing. So it won't be easy for Russian propagandists, the likes of RT, to kind of portray the protests as being Western stooges because they're not overtly pro-Western and they're not overtly anti-Russian. Um, Culturally, Belarus is has a lot of ties with Russia. It is literally white Russia, um, but it's also got its own distinctive national character, and so it's an interesting situation. Um, Apparently, Putin congratulated Lukashenko, but it was somewhat lukewarm, and the Times describes it as almost more like a list of demands. Lukashenko has played off Europe with Russia, so he's gambled for a very long time, and now finally his time is up. I think my gut feeling is Moscow's going to throw him under the bus, so to speak. But I've no sympathy. This is a man who's ruled by brutality, some of the worst human rights record. I mean, one of the worst human rights record out of any of the former Soviet states. And it's just going to be interesting to see what happens. I do hope things don't escalate, but if they do, just look at RT spinning it. I still feel rather disgusted that we allow RT to air in this country. I mean, after the Salisbury attack, their response was sheer insults to the victims. Um, Margarita Simonian herself has been a very arrogant and jingoistic propagandist for Putin and the Kremlin. I find her very obnoxious. Um, when Ofcom gave them a fine, um, instead of actually, recognizing that they had broken our journalistic values, our standards, which is what they need to abide by in order to have a broadcast here, instead of actually saying, okay, we'll try to comply. Their response was arrogance and ridicule. So Margarita Simonian, I'd like to see her knocked down a peg or two by having her network kicked out of this country. As far as I'm concerned, it's as bad as any weapon. But the good news is very, very few people actually watch it in Britain. And, just let's see what happens. But, they can't portray the protesters as being stooges of the West because this is very internalized. They're fed up with the regime, but they're not necessarily calling for closer ties to the West. They can't be portrayed that way. Um, in that sense, it's different from the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine in 2014. So it's an interesting situation. But you know, cue Russia spinning this. Um, Apparently, Russian state media is being really focalizing on the protests. Um, I have RT. I try not to spend too long on it. I don't want to give them airtime, but um, they will find a way to spin this against the West. They always do. RT is incredibly jingoistic. It's incredibly Western phobic, and yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But make no mistake about it, the problems that Belarus has are entirely down to the brutality of Lukashenko and his regime. There's no rational way Russian state media can try and blame this on the West. It's human nature. The more people get beaten and brutalized, eventually they're going to get sick of it, and that's what's happened.